She bled out in the freezing snow, her body a human shield for a trembling wolf pup. They buried her at dawn, just another casualty of the beast wars. But at dusk the earth shook. The Alpha King didn't come to mourn her. He came to dig her up. Historical records from the parish archives of St. Jude, dated December 14th, 1792, speak of a winter so devastating it froze the birds mid-flight. But in the isolated logging village of Oakhaven, the cold was the least of their worries. Oakhaven sat on the border of the northern reaches, a territory fiercely contested by warring factions of Lycans. The villagers knew the rules. Lock your doors at dusk, never wander into the whispering woods, and turn a blind eye to the screams echoing in the dark. Laura Hawthorne was not one to turn a blind eye. At 22, Leora was the village apothecary, having inherited the trade after the consumption took her father, William Hawthorne, 3 years prior. She was a practical, grounded woman who dealt in poultices, bone-setting, and yarrow ointments. She did not believe in fairy tales, but she knew the monsters in the woods were real. The night the blizzard hit its peak, Leora heard a sound that defied the howling wind, a high-pitched, desperate whimpering scratching at her reinforced oak door. Armed with a heavy iron fire poker, Miora unlatched the heavy deadbolt. What collapsed onto her floor was not a man, but a massive silver-furred she-wolf. The beast was riddled with deep, jagged wounds, her side stained crimson. Laura froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, fully expecting the creature to lunge. Instead, the dying wolf nudged a small, trembling bundle of fur from beneath her bloody belly toward Leora's boots. It was a pup, no larger than a loaf of bread, with striking ice-blue eyes and a coat of pure midnight black. The mother looked up at Leora, let out one final rattling breath, and died on the apothecary floor. Leora could have thrown the pup back into the storm. Harboring a Lycan was a crime punishable by hanging under the decree of the local magistrate, Arthur Pendleton. But looking at the shivering creature, Leora didn't see a monster. She saw an orphan. "All right, little one," Leora whispered, scooping the freezing pup into her apron. "You're safe now." She named him Leo. For 2 weeks, Laura hid Leo in the root cellar beneath her floorboards. She fed him goat's milk and scraps of venison, watching as he grew at an unnatural, rapid pace. He was fiercely intelligent, tracking her movements and offering protective, low growls whenever strangers walked past the shop. Lawyer knew she couldn't keep him forever, but she promised herself she would wait until the spring thaw to release him into the mountains. She never got the chance. On the eve of the winter solstice, the rogue pack descended on Oakhaven. They were led by Garrick, an exiled Lycan warlord known for his ruthlessness. Garrick was hunting a specific prize, the stolen heir to the northern reaches. The silver she-wolf Leora had found was the former Alpha's sister, and the pup was the last pure-blood heir to the royal lineage. The village awoke to the sound of splintering wood and terrified screams. Leora peered through her frosted window and saw massive, hulking figures tearing through the snow, dragging villagers from their homes. Garrick, in his human form, stood in the town square. "Bring me the pup, or I burn this village to the ash it deserves to be." Garrick roared, his voice carrying the unnatural resonance of an alpha command. Leora knew they would search every house. She rushed to the root cellar, grabbed Leo, who was now the size of a large hound, and shoved him into the deepest, darkest corner behind heavy barrels of salted pork. "Do not make a sound, Leo, no matter what you hear. Promise me," Leora commanded, her voice trembling. The young wolf whimpered, his ice-blue eyes wide with understanding, and curled into a tight ball. Leora shut the heavy trapdoor, threw a rug over it, and dragged a massive iron apothecary table directly over the hidden entrance. Just as she finished, her front door exploded inward. 3 of Garrick's brutes stepped into the shop, their eyes glowing with predatory amber light. They sniffed the air, their lips curling into sneers. "Smells like wet dog and human fear," one of them sneered. "Where is he, girl?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Leora lied, backing away slowly, her hand gripping a glass jar of pure wolfsbane powder she kept for emergencies. "Don't play games," the brute snarled, lunging forward. Leora threw the glass jar into his face. It shattered, sending a cloud of toxic, burning dust into the air. The Lycan screamed, clawing at his melting eyes, but his two companions charged. Leora fought like a cornered animal. She drove her iron fire poker into the shoulder of the second attacker. But she was only human. The third brute, a massive man with a scarred jaw, backhanded her with the force of a battering ram. Laura flew across the room, crashing hard against a stone fireplace. Her ribs shattered on impact. She collapsed directly over the rug that hid the trapdoor. The brute loomed over her, drawing a long, serrated hunting knife. "If you won't tell us where the pup is, you can die with his mother's stench on you." Aid! He plunged the blade deep into Leora's chest. The pain was a blinding, white-hot flash that robbed the air from her lungs. The rogues quickly ransacked the upper shelves, shattering bottles and overturning chairs. Finding no obvious hiding spots, and convinced by Leora's rapidly pooling blood that the scent they tracked was merely lingering from the dead mother, they spat on the floor and walked out into the storm. Leora lay on the freezing floorboards, her lifeblood spilling out in a dark, thick halo. She could hear Leo whining softly beneath the floorboards, scratching at the wood. "Shh," Leora gasped, blood bubbling at her lips. She forced her broken body to spread out further across the trapdoor, ensuring her own blood would completely mask the scent of the wolf pup below. Her vision darkened, the edges of the room fading into a snowy blur. She felt the vibrations of the rogues leaving the village, their hunt deemed a failure. Leora closed her eyes, a small bloody smile gracing her lips. She had protected the innocent. As the cold overtook her entirely, Leora Hawthorne took her last jagged breath, and the world went silently, completely dark. When the morning sun finally broke through the grey clouds, the survivors of Oakhaven crept out of the woods. The village elder, Thomas Wright, led the grim task of cataloguing the dead. When they found Leora's ruined shop, several of the village women wept openly. Leora had delivered their babies and cured their fevers. "The ground is too hard for a proper resting place," Thomas muttered, wiping a tear from his weathered cheek. "But we cannot leave her to the scavengers." They buried Leora Hawthorne in the frozen soil of the old parish graveyard, chiseling her name into a modest slate marker. They did not find the root cellar. They did not hear the faint, exhausted breathing of the pup beneath the floorboards. They simply covered the blood with sand, boarded up the apothecary, and left her to the earth. 24 hours later, the temperature plummeted again. But this time the chill did not come from the weather. It came from the tree line. A terrifying silence fell over Oakhaven. The remaining dogs whimpered and hid beneath porches. The crows stopped cawing. Emerging from the whispering woods was an army of Royal Lycan guards, their armor gleaming like polished obsidian against the snow. At their head rode Kaelin Ashford, the Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. Kaelin was a terrifying figure of absolute authority. Standing well over 6.5 feet tall, his eyes were the color of forged steel, and his presence exerted a suffocating physical pressure on the humans of the village. He had been tracking Garrick's rogues for weeks, desperate to find his murdered sister's stolen pup, the sole heir to his dying bloodline. Thomas Wright stepped forward, his knees knocking together, and bowed deeply. "My king, we had nothing left. The rogues took our food, destroyed our homes, and killed our healer." Kaelin ignored the old man. His steel eyes scanned the village, his nostrils flaring. The scent of his sister's blood was faint, but another scent caught his attention. It was a mixture of crushed yarrow, wild honey, and an overwhelming metallic tang of iron. Without a word, Kaelin dismounted his massive destrier. He walked with predatory grace toward the boarded-up apothecary. He kicked the heavy oak door off its hinges with a single, effortless strike. The interior was a frozen tomb of shattered glass and dried blood. Kaelin knelt by the massive bloodstain near the fireplace. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He could smell the desperation. He could smell the bravery. And then his ears twitched. A faint, rhythmic thumping. Kaelin grabbed the edge of the massive iron table and hurled it across the room like it weighed nothing. He ripped the rug away and tore the trapdoor open, splintering the locking mechanism. Down in the dark, shivering but very much alive, was the black-coated pup. Rowan, Kaelin breathed, using the pup's true royal name. The pup looked up, recognizing his uncle's scent, but he didn't leap into Kaelin's arms. Instead, the young wolf scrambled out of the cellar, darted past the king, and ran straight out the door, his nose to the ground. Kaelin followed, his royal guard stepping aside as the pup sprinted through the snow. The pup ran straight to the parish graveyard, stopping abruptly in front of a freshly turned mound of frozen dirt marked with a slate stone, Leora Hawthorne. The pup began to dig frantically, whining in distress. Kaelin approached the grave. As he stood over the disturbed earth, a violent shudder racked his massive frame. His wolf, the primal spirit that resided within him, suddenly slammed against his ribs, howling in sheer, unadulterated agony. Kaelin fell to his knees, clutching his chest. Mate, the word echoed in his mind, deafening and absolute. It was impossible. He had spent a century searching for his fated mate, the other half of his soul designed by the moon goddess, only to find absolutely nothing. Yet here, standing over a shallow grave in a forgotten human village, the bond snapped into place with violent clarity. The scent of yarrow and honey rising from the earth belonged to her. "No!" Kaelin roared, a sound so devastating it shattered the frost on the surrounding tombstones. No, he didn't order his guards to dig. He threw his gauntlets aside and began tearing into the frozen earth with his bare hands. His claws extended, slicing through roots and ice, his fingers bleeding as he excavated the grave with frantic, terrifying speed. "My king, what are you doing?" yelled his commander, stepping forward. "Back away," Kaelin snarled, his eyes flashing brilliant, lethal gold. Within minutes, he reached her. Leora was wrapped in a simple linen shroud. Kaelin pulled her out of the dirt, cradling her limp, freezing body against his chest. She was pale as marble, her lips tinged blue, the massive wound in her chest stiff with dried blood. Kaelin pressed his ear to her chest. Silence. Tears hot and unbidden spill from the Alpha King's eyes, dropping onto Leora's frozen cheeks. "You gave your life for my blood," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I will not let the earth take you." But as Kaelin brushed the dirt from her neck, his enhanced senses caught something impossible. The rogues had struck her with a blade coated in lethal wolfsbane. While deadly to a Lycan, pure concentrated wolfsbane had a drastically different effect on human physiology when introduced directly into the bloodstream. It acted as a powerful paralytic, slowing the heart rate down to 1 beat every few minutes. The cold had done the rest, throwing her into a state of deep, suspended animation. Leora Hawthorne was not dead. She was trapped on the razor's edge between worlds. "She is mine," Kaelin growled to the sky. Without hesitation, Kaelin bit down brutally on his own wrist. Lycan alpha blood was the most potent regenerative substance on the continent, capable of healing fatal wounds and burning toxins from the veins. He pried Leora's blue lips apart and pressed his bleeding wrist against her mouth, forcing the glowing hot blood down her throat. "Drink, little bird," he commanded softly, channeling every ounce of his life force into her. "Come back to me." For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. The wind howled through the graveyard. The guards watched in stunned silence. The pup whimpered at their feet. Then Leora's chest hitched. A violent spasm arched her spine. She gasped a sharp, ragged intake of air that sounded like tearing silk. Her chest heaved, the alpha's blood rapidly knitting the severed tissues of her heart and lungs back together. Color rushed back into her cheeks, chasing away the pallor of death. Leora's eyes flew open. She was disoriented, terrified, and gasping for air. Her gaze locked onto the terrifying golden eyes of the massive man holding her. "Leo," she wheezed, her voice a raspy whisper. Kaelin pulled her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her frost-covered hair. The Alpha King, feared across 3 kingdoms, wept into her neck. "He is safe," Kaelin swore to her, the mating bond roaring to life between them, wrapping them in an invisible tether of absolute devotion. "You are both safe. I have you." "Now, Talbot," That's wrong. Oh, so Leora Hawthorne had died a human martyr in the snow. She woke up in the arms of the king, utterly unaware that her life and the history of the Northern Reaches had just been rewritten forever. The transition was not a peaceful slumber. It was a crucible of fire. The 3 days and 3 nights within the heavily guarded walls of Castle Alder, Leora Hawthorne burned with a fever that would have reduced an ordinary human to ash. The royal physician, Dr. Henry Arris, documented the phenomenon in his private medical journals, noting that the Alpha King's blood acted as both a violent invader and a miraculous architect, dismantling Leora's human frailties and forging something entirely new. When Leora finally opened her eyes, the world was aggressively loud. She could hear the rhythmic pacing of guards 2 floors below, the frantic fluttering of a moth's wings against the velvet curtains, and the steady, powerful heartbeat of the man sitting beside her bed. Calen Ashford looked as though he had not slept in a century. The terrifying Alpha King, whose very name commanded fear across the Northern Reaches, was slumped in a gilded chair, his head resting near her hand. At the sound of her breath catching, his steel eyes snapped open. The relief that washed over his harsh features was absolute. "You are awake," Calen murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble that sent an unfamiliar electric shiver down Leora's spine. He reached out his massive calloused hand, gently brushing a damp lock of hair from her forehead. "How do you feel?" Leora tried to sit up, expecting the agonizing crunch of her shattered ribs, but there was no pain. Her chest was completely whole. She looked down at her hands, turning them over. Her skin hummed with a strange, boundless energy. "I feel powerful." "What did you do to me?" "You were dying, Leora," Calen explained softly, uttering her name with a reverence that felt almost sacred. "You were poisoned by wolfsbane and freezing to death. I gave you my blood, it healed you, but it also awakened the bond between us. You are my mate. The moon goddess chose you for me, and my blood recognized its queen." Leora stared at him, her practical, apothecary mind struggling to process the fairy tale unfolding around her. "I am a healer from a logging village. I mix poultices for a living. I am no queen." Before Calen could answer, the heavy oak doors creaked open. A small, black-furred blur darted into the room, leaping onto the bed. Rowan, the royal pup, licked Leora's face frantically, whining with joy. Leora let out a breathless laugh, wrapping her arms around the wolf. "You saved his life, Leora. You sacrificed yourself for a child of my bloodline," Calen said, his gaze hardening with a terrifying promise. "And now I must go and ensure the ones who brought this violence to your door pay with their lives." The War Council of Castle of Alder had tracked Garrick and his rogue faction to the desolate crags of the Daggerhorn Mountains, leaving Leora under the strict protection of his most trusted commander. Calen rode out at dusk. The king did not march with an army. He took only 12 of his elite vanguard. This was not a war, it was an execution. The blizzard had subsided, leaving the mountain pass buried in 3 feet of fresh snow. Calen caught Garrick's scent near a network of abandoned iron mines. The rogues thought they were safe, hidden deep within the cavernous dark, but they had fundamentally underestimated the wrath of a mated alpha. Calen did not bother drawing his broadsword. As he breached the cavern entrance, his bones cracked and shifted in a violent, fluid symphony of transformation. Within seconds, the king stood in his lichen form, a monstrous 9-foot-tall beast covered in midnight blue fur, his claws like sides of obsidian. The slaughter was swift and absolute. The vanguard secured the exits while Calen tore through Garrick's forces like a hurricane of teeth and claws. He felt no mercy. These were the beasts that had driven a blade into Leora's chest. Finally, Calen cornered Garrick against the back wall of the mine. The rogue leader was bleeding profusely, his bravado entirely broken. Calen shifted back into his human form, naked and covered in the blood of his enemies, his golden eyes glowing with lethal intent in the dim cavern light. "Where is the pup?" Garrick spat, coughing up dark blood. "You cannot hide him forever, Kaelin." Kaelin stepped forward, his hand wrapping around Garrick's throat, lifting the massive rogue off the ground with one arm. "Roan is safe behind the iron gates of Alder, but you will never see the dawn again. Give me one reason not to tear your head from your shoulders this very second." Garrick choked, a dark, manic laugh bubbling from his lips. You think I planned this? You think a banished rogue had the coin to orchestrate a royal assassination?" He grinned, his teeth stained red. "Look to your own house, King. The gold that paid for your sister's murder came from inside your own court." Kaelin's grip tightened. "Give me a name." Garrick leaned in, whispering the name of the traitor with his dying breath. Kaelin dropped the lifeless body to the cavern floor. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow, but the shock quickly calcified into a terror so profound it made his heart stutter. The traitor was not here in the mountains. The traitor was back at Castle Alder, and Liora was locked inside with him. Within the heavily fortified walls of Castle Alder, Laura was beginning to understand the magnitude of her new reality. Her senses were overwhelmingly sharp. She could smell the impending rain hours before the clouds gathered, and she could hear the hushed, treasonous whispers of the court nobles who despised the idea of a human-born queen. But her most pressing concern was Lord Percival Graves. Graves was Kaelin's chief advisor, an elegant, silver-haired Lycan who had practically raised the king. He had been nothing but overly polite to Liora since her arrival, showering her with silk gowns and assigning an excessive number of guards to her door. Yet Liora's instincts, both human and newly, wolf-screamed that the man was a snake. On the fourth evening of Kaelin's absence, Lord Graves personally brought a silver tray of chamomile tea to Liora's chambers. He smiled warmly, the firelight catching the heavy emerald signet ring on his finger. "Through your nerves, my lady," Graves purred, setting the delicate porcelain cup on her mahogany nightstand. "The transition to alpha blood is taxing. This will help you sleep." Liora thanked him, but as Graves turned to leave, the steam rising from the cup hit her enhanced olfactory senses. Beneath the floral scent of chamomile was a sharp, metallic bitterness. It was Aconitum napellus, Monksford, highly concentrated wolfsbane. By time her blood ran cold. She was an apothecary. She knew exactly what that dosage would do to a Lycan or a newly turning human. It would paralyze the respiratory system within minutes, making death look like a tragic, sudden failure of the heart. "Lord Graves," Liora called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. He paused at the door, turning back with a polite smile. "Yes, Lady Liora. Where are the two guards who are usually stationed outside my balcony?" she asked, her eyes darting to the empty terrace. Graves' smile vanished, replaced by a cold reptilian stare. "You are remarkably perceptive for a village girl." "A pity." He snapped his fingers. The heavy oak doors locked from the outside, and 3 rogue Lycan's mercenaries smuggled into the castle under the guise of servants stepped from the shadows of her adjoining dressing room. Rowan, who had been sleeping by the hearth, instantly woke, baring his tiny fangs and letting out a fierce, protective snarl. "Kill the human, but make it look like a struggle with the pup. Then snap the pup's neck," Graves commanded coldly. "When Kaelin returns, I will tell him the wild beast turned on his mate, and my men were too late to save either of them. The royal line will end, and the council will have no choice but to name me regent." As the mercenaries lunged, they expected a terrified, helpless human. They did not realize that Liora Hawthorne was a survivor who had already faced death in the snow. And now she had the blood of the Alpha King coursing through her veins. Liora grabbed the silver tray and hurled the boiling wolfsbane-laced tea directly into the face of the first attacker. He shrieked as the toxic liquid seared his eyes and skin, collapsing in a heap. The second mercenary swiped at her, but Liora ducked with unnatural, lightning-fast reflexes. She rolled across the floor, snatching her leather apothecary satchel from the desk. She had spent the last 3 days discreetly gathering supplies from the castle gardens. As the two remaining rogues cornered her and Rowan against the stone fireplace, Leora plunged her hand into the satchel, pulling out a handful of highly combustible magnesium shavings and crushed belladonna root. She threw the powder directly into the roaring fire. The fireplace erupted in a blinding, deafening flash of white light and toxic smoke. The rogues stumbled back, blinded and coughing violently as the belladonna smoke filled their lungs. Leora didn't hesitate. Grabbing the heavy iron fire poker, a poetic echo of her last stand in Oakhaven, she channeled every ounce of her newly awakened alpha strength. She swung the iron rod like a bat, shattering the kneecap of the second rogue, sending him crashing to the floor. Graves, coughing through the smoke, drew a silver dagger and lunged blindly toward the sound of Rowan's barking. "I will end this bloodline myself," he roared. Leora intercepted him. She grabbed Graves by his fine velvet lapels, her own eyes flashing a brilliant, terrifying gold. The sheer force of her grip fractured the advisor's collarbone. With a primal roar, she lifted the grown Lycan off his feet and hurled him backward into the heavy mahogany wardrobe. The wood splintered, and Graves slumped to the floor, stunned and broken. Suddenly, the locked oak doors were blown off their hinges, shattering into thousands of splinters. Kalen stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his armor slick with the blood of the mountain rogues. He had ridden his horse to death to get back, fueled by the sheer terror of Garrick's confession. He took in the chaotic scene, the blinded mercenaries, the shattered furniture, Lord Graves bleeding on the floor, and Leora standing protectively over Rowan, gripping a bloody iron poker, her eyes glowing with alpha fire. The king let out a breath he felt he had been holding for days. He stepped into the room, his vanguard filtering in behind him to drag the traitors away. Kalen ignored them all. He walked straight to Leora, dropping to his knees before her. He took her trembling, blood-stained hands in his, pressing his forehead against her knuckles. "I thought I had lost you," Kalen whispered, his voice thick with raw emotion. Leora dropped the iron poker, her golden eyes fading back to their natural warm hazel. She gently cupped the Alpha King's face, her thumb tracing the harsh line of his jaw. "I told you, Kalen, I am a healer. I know how to deal with pests. Now, Togt. And now." 3 months later, the parish of Oakhaven received a royal envoy bearing carts of grain, gold, and building supplies, a personal gift from the crown. And back in the grand hall of Castle Alder, beneath the banners of the northern reaches, Leora Hawthorne stood beside Kalen Ashford. She wore a crown of forged iron and winter roses, not just as a fated mate, but as the true, undisputed Lycan queen who had bled for her people before she ever wore a crown. Did Leora's explosive takedown of the traitor leave you speechless? From a bleeding human shield to the fierce, undisputed Lycan queen, Laura proved that true strength doesn't always require fangs. If you loved this epic tale of sacrifice, betrayal, and a fated bond that defied death, smash that like button, share it with your pack, and subscribe for more thrilling werewolf dramas. Drop a comment. Did you suspect Lord Graves?